possibilidade de ganhar ou perder quantias maiores que o PIB de muitos países movimentou durante anos o mercado financeiro. A aposta era baseada na crença quase inabalável de que o livre mercado garantiria lucros para sempre. A crise de 2008, inicialmente vista como uma breve recessão, mostrou que o risco é muito maior do que se acreditava. Gradualmente, os principais centros econômicos do mundo foram afetados. Na zona do euro, a dificuldade dos países de pagarem as dívidas ameaça a sobrevivência da moeda comum. Do outro lado do Atlântico, os Estados Unidos enfrentam uma situação delicada. A recuperação econômica é anêmica e o desemprego continua alto. E em todo o planeta, as projeções de crescimento dos países emergentes caem a cada estimativa. O economista Kenneth Rogoff, autor do livro Time is Different, desta vez é diferente, analisou mais de 8 séculos de crises e mapeou o comportamento errático da evolução da economia e descobriu que a crise atual não tem nada de diferente das anteriores. Seguiu e segue os mesmos ciclos. O que de um lado é animador, porque como as anteriores, esta terá um fim. Mas preocupa, porque quase todos os envolvidos seguiram e seguem, cegos, o mesmo caminho que levou a tantos desastres ao longo da história.
It's interesting that your publishers in Brazil decided to put the subtitle as the main title, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly, right? What is financial folly?
Well, just the human arrogance and ignorance that lies behind financial crises where during the boom, people say everything's fantastic. The government says we're doing a great job. Investors say we're geniuses. People are very happy. They're consuming a lot. And there's certain times when things are, going so well, you should be thinking, wait a second, maybe this should slow down. So, yeah, that was the phrase. Of course, the main title this time is different is supposed to be ironic, that it's not different, but people are always saying it's different, either before or after.
So explain to us what you and Carmen Reinhart found about all those crises over 8 centuries that is common to all of them.
Well, one feature we found that surprised us was how universal they are, because so many people believed, even scholars believed, it was a feature of Latin America, maybe a couple Central European countries. But when you look at a longer sweep of history, every type of crisis has hit the advanced countries. Spain has defaulted on its debt to foreigners 13 times. France, 9 times. So, these things are not unknown elsewhere. And Greece, one thing we discovered, I don't know, is Greece an advanced country, but they have been in default every other year since independence in 1828. It's universal. Another thing we found is that, particularly if you're talking about banking crises, that's of course what we just experienced, they never stopped in the advanced countries. They're very similar in not just in how much output goes down, but how much unemployment goes up, what happens to housing prices and stock prices. We were stunned. There are things where you're trying to reach and try to find some parallels, but as we started laying out the figures and the charts from looking at this historical data, we just couldn't believe it. And we had studied debt crises and financial crises our whole lives, but we hadn't had this data set that we put together before. So it took us 7 years to write the book, and a lot of it was very dry and tedious. But there are these moments, you see the thing unfold, you just can't believe it. And so those are certainly the two striking things, the universality and the similarity.
Yeah. At what point did you notice that something like that was going to happen when the book was, before the book was going to be published?
Well, I think it's actually very hard to call the timing of a financial crisis. The people who say they knew when the crisis would happen, if you look carefully, every year they were in business. They said that a crisis was going to happen. I think you can say when you see the kind of numbers you saw in the U.S., this isn't going to last 10 years. This is going to blow. But is it going to be 10 days? Is it going to be 10 months? Many investors know, I'm not an investor, but many investors know you can have the greatest idea, but if you're off by a year, you lose your shirt. And but we were sure there would be more crises. That didn't worry us at all. But of course, exactly what happened and how it unfolded, no, we didn't know.
And it turned out to be what you call the second great retraction. Contraction.
Yeah, we try to give a name different than a recession to this, because in our estimation, calling it a recession just is misdiagnosing the animal. It's like saying, you have a bad cold. The Great Recession is the common phrase in English. I don't know what you use in Portuguese, but it's like you have a bad cold. This isn't a bad cold. This is pneumonia. This is a different animal. And I think our view is using the wrong terminology, describing it in the wrong way, is misleading about what to do. Because when you have a recession, if you go down a lot, you go up a lot. If you go down a little, you go up a little. So what everyone was saying, from the president's advisors to the top Wall Street economists, were, well, this has been a terrible recession, but it's going to be a fantastic boom. So let's just stay calm and not worry. And what we had found in our research is, no, it's a different animal. When you have your banking system collapse, as it basically did in the United States, the shadow banking system collapsed. When you have a crisis like that, then you go down a lot, you go very slowly back up. And we said that, and we were viewed as very dark, but very much the United States and a lot of the other advanced countries have tracked this very typical pattern where the recovery is slow, painful. It can take a decade or more, and we're really in the middle of it, in a way, in the recovery.
So the Eurozone crisis is part of it, right?
Yeah.
Some people say it's a different thing. What is it?
It is a different manifestation of the same crisis. So one thing we find also is when you have worldwide banking crises, or at least big regional crises, then one of the aftershocks, something that happens afterwards, usually a few years later, is you start to get governments to default. So it starts out as a private phenomenon, banking's usually getting in trouble, eventually gets governments into trouble. There's sort of two reasons. One reason is obvious. The government's bailing out the banks, the economy's tanking, you're losing taxes, your debt's soaring. We said that. That's one of the reasons. But the other reason is, if you're a big borrower and something just scares everybody in the markets, you're caught naked. I mean, you're in trouble. And so, in a way, the phenomenon of what happened in Greece in particular is different than what happened in the United Kingdom and what happened in the United States. But in a sense, it was an accident waiting to happen. They're not robust to having a big shakeup. So the Euro crisis, at least at some points, just a sovereign debt crisis. It's worse because they have the euro, which was really not resilient to this kind of problem.
So what do you expect to happen?
Well, are we talking about the United States, Europe, China?
First Europe.
Europe is a very tough call, and I think it's a little bit about like trying to understand somebody else's marriage from the outside. They seem to be not fighting, but they really can't stand each other. They seem to be fighting all the time, but they seem to love each other, and you don't really know. And it's a political problem in Europe. It's not strictly a financial problem. But at the root, they never should have gone so fast to having a common currency. Now that's very easy to say after the fact. It was a really bad idea. And they either have to fix it and create a governance system, create a real union to justify having a common currency, or they got to break up. And I don't think there's anything in the middle. And if they do break up completely, that really would be horrible. I mean, we can't go into how bad that would be, especially if it takes place in the next 5 years. I mean, it takes place over 50 years. I don't know what to say, but if it takes place quickly, they're not prepared. Nobody's prepared for that.
What about China?
China.
Everybody's worried about China.
Yeah, it's funny.
The engine is sputtering.
Yeah, I've been viewed as a China bear for a long time because I've been going around saying, I've written articles in the New York Times and Financial Times saying, look, the Chinese are fantastic, it's the economy of the future, but you got to be kidding if you just think it's going to go like that and never have a slowdown. never have a crisis. That just doesn't happen. And there were so few people saying that a few years ago. I would find myself getting quoted 8 months later because they couldn't find anyone else who'd said that in the meantime. So basically, you can just take what I said. It just doesn't happen. That's the most powerful argument. But again, it's very hard to call the timing of these things. And to boot with China, they fudge the data, they massage the data. We might never know exactly when it happened, but it's very clear that they're slowing down, which of course for emerging markets would be very scary if it happens fast.
In 2009, beginning of 2009, President Lula was in New York and I interviewed him. And he said, this is not going to hit us because we did the homework, we are in solid ground, and this time it's different, right? It's not going to hit us, and you're going to see we're going to grow. And the next year, Brazil had a record growth, and they said, we told you we are the best, we are going to grow. And now this year, what happened? Brazil has a paltry growth, and they're blaming Europe now. What do you think about that situation?
Well, first of all, I think Brazil did do a lot of homework and created macro stability. But you know, it's a little like my son might have done homework 3 years ago, but if he's not doing homework this year, you're not keeping up with the class. And I think the rate at which Brazil's been doing its homework's really slowed down, that they haven't reformed the tax system, you haven't reformed the pension system, there's all kinds of infrastructure you ought to build, but there's so much corruption in the states and the government that you can't do it easily. There are things Brazil needs to do to achieve more than it can. And as long as China was booming and you're flexible enough that you're exporting a lot of commodities, it was pretty
partner,
good.
Right?
But China is slowing down, and you have to look elsewhere. So I think you know, certainly Brazil moved to a different level than it had been. Let's face it. But on the other hand, you want to keep going. You want to keep moving, and this is a worrying moment.
What do you think Brazil could do differently now? I mean, one thing that worries me, 36, 38%, the numbers change.
The size of the government.
Burden, no, the tax, the tax burden, 36%, sometimes almost 40%. Can a country grow, an emerging market country grow with a tax burden like that? Nobody in Brazil is complaining about that mostly. It's weird. It's like, well, it's okay.
I hear a lot of people complaining about it, but maybe too many of my friends. No, too many of my friends are economists in Brazil. So I think that's the thing everybody points to as the main vulnerability. It's not just the size, but the inflexibility of the government. I'd say something like 80% of government expenditures are in the form of transfers, payments to civil servants, things that can't be changed. So Brazil doesn't have a lot of flexibility within that. And obviously shrinking the government would be growth enhancing. Obviously making the tax system more efficient would be growth enhancing. And one of the great puzzles in international economics is why your interest rates were so high for so long. They're coming down a lot, but one of the reasons certainly they had been so high had to do with people being nervous about the history, about the inflexibility. So there are obviously a lot of things that Brazil can do, but you know, you need to get new energy to do them. And I understand it's not easy in a democracy. It's not like we're doing stuff in the United States. I mean, we're pretty paralyzed here. I'm very, very worried about our future.
Were you at the IMF when the real crisis happened?
So I was there from 2001 to 2003, so not the 1999 when it floated. Absolutely, absolutely. It was a very unique moment. I certainly favored the bailout that we did, and I didn't favor many. A little bit was having been a professor, I knew if you oppose every tenure appointment, no one listens to you, so you have to be in favor of something. But I also felt Brazil, you know, had basically the core of a program that made sense, that it was a reasonable risk. And I think it was a success. The IMF's had failures. At least I would adjudicate that one as having been successful.
Why was it a success?
Well, I think it was a success because it came in very big. It really came in with overwhelming force that calmed down markets. But fundamentally, it was a success because President Lula, who won, followed the same macroeconomic policies, and that was a huge surprise to markets. That was the stabilizing moment. If he had followed policies like your neighbors to the south, Brazil program would have blown up for sure. So that the big change was it showed economic and political stability, and you're still living off of that because now people think when there's a global financial crisis, you just had a normal recession. 10 years ago, if there'd been or certainly 15 years ago, if there'd been a global financial crisis, Brazil would still be recovering from it. But instead, you had something more normal. So I think certainly the big credit goes to that transition. And it's also the technocrats in Brazil that designed, I think, a pretty good program.
Going back to this time, it's different. Since you show with Carmen Reinhart that it's not different, it's always the same sequence.
Oh, there are a lot of patterns anyway.
Yeah, but essentially, why this denial? When you talk about folly, I remember the March of Fools, Barbara Tuchman's book about wars and people believing that over history, that this time we're going to win. Obviously, they were not. So what blinds people to and governments to the reality of what's going on? Why this denial of reality?
Well, I mean, there's a certain part of human nature of this optimism, this willingness to take on challenges is really good. I mean, we've had financial crises as far back as we've had civilization, but civilization has progressed. Every country experiences giant financial crises, but most countries are much better off than they were a couple hundred years ago. So it's we humans have a lot of great qualities, but there's no question that when things are going well, there's a tendency to think it's us, that we're geniuses, the government's really good. And when you have a boom that's fueled by a lot of credit, a lot of loans, you feel really good. It's like you're taking a drug. And when the drug comes away, you collapse. And it's an amazingly common pattern. These crises are very similar regardless of the legal system, regardless, of the culture. It's remarkably universal. If you look at the macroeconomic footprints of a financial crisis, it doesn't matter where you are. And I think it suggests to Reinhart and I that there's something deeper in human nature about our arrogance, our ignorance, that just cuts across political systems, legal systems, that you get this commonality. Again, it was very exciting to us to find out how similar they were. It's a thing you think, oh, you're happy just to show some common patterns, but if you look at our charts and graphs, it's really remarkable.
It's interesting that you write that both you and Carmen Reinhart have in common that you're very cynical about governments. What does that mean?
Well, governments will tell you everything's fine, and it isn't. I mean, you can go to Europe today. Let's look at the Greek crisis. Oh, Greece as a European country will never have a problem. Oh, we'll need a little bit of a loan. Oh, well, maybe they will have to lose a little money to the private creditors. Oh, maybe we will have to kick Greece out of the euro. I mean, just at each step, there's this denial. It's very, very common. And we, as professionals, especially who study countries building up to crisis, the denial is just stunning. I mean, it's a very much a common theme among crises. So I think it made us very naturally engaged that we had this common point about seeing what the government said, and the better they say it is, often the more you should worry.
I'm worried about how the media covers. Because we listen to the governments, we reproduce what they say, but how can we, journalists, understand from your book how to cover, how to understand the crisis that happened?
Well, I think it's had an impression in a number of ways. So one certainly is we made this point. No, it is not going to be a fast recovery. This is going to last a long time. Here's why. Here's what happened. And at first, we were mocked for saying that. The New York Times covered it a lot, but they said, there are these crazy people who say that it's going to last 4 or 5 years getting worse on unemployment, who say it's going to take 4 or 5 years for output just get back the same level that it started. Well, that's extreme. And gradually, I think a lot of people looked at that, and that's certainly one area that it's glommed around. And obviously the other is in the distant future, when your debts are piling up and when your economy's steamrolling along. Our book gives benchmarks. where are worrisome signs? When do you need to worry? It's not a science, nothing's precise, and yet there are certain historical benchmarks which you should revisit things and worry, and hopefully people will do that in the future.
Like when debt goes beyond 60% of GDP?
When you borrow abroad more than 60% of GDP and you're an emerging market, that's problematic. And for any country, when your public debt gets over 90 or 100% of GDP, and many people have gone crazy about our saying this, but I think we've documented that. I should just say that one of the most original things in our data set was we provided data on public debt, on government debt going very far back. You would be amazed how hard that was to do. You think banks lie about their balance sheets? They have nothing on governments. That's one of the most remarkable findings of our book, is to uncover this data that lets you see these patterns.
And going back to my question, so your advice for journalists would be, when government tells you everything is okay, this time it's different, don't believe them.
So, I'll give a really honest answer to that, was being at the IMF and seeing this in practice. A problem journalism has in many places that you depend on these people. You can go write a piece saying, Pedro Milan was not telling us the truth. That's fine, but then go try to get an interview with him the next day, and if you're never able to have access, you can't cover it. There's this very subtle cat and mouse game that goes on between the journalists and the government, where if you question too much, or your paper questions too much, or your TV station questions too much, they pull back. That goes on all over the world. And that, I'm sure everyone's aware of it. You're independent, but you need these people to talk to you. And so I think it's a very difficult challenge for journalism.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very good.
Pleasure.